Okay, so let's get into some of the academic debates over the actual evidence, sort of shifting now from whether you should do the historical critical work to when you do the historical critical work. What does that look like in regard to the study of the Quran? And I'd like to just get right to maybe the most contentious issue, and maybe, I don't know, the issue that's had the most attention in controversies over the Quran recently, and that's carbon dating of Quran manuscripts. So, I mean, many viewers will be familiar that there's been a lot of attention to recent carbon dating of Quran manuscripts. Earlier guests on this podcast channel's YouTube channel, have spoken about this and sort of defended the reliability of these tests when they're analyzed properly. And I'd just like to read a passage. This is a passage from Nikolai Sinai's The Quran, a Historical Critical Introduction, just to get some dates out there which give us a perspective on recent testing of Quran manuscripts. So he writes, the testing of a folio belonging to a very substantial Quranic palimpsest, and we could speak about what a palimpsest is, discovered in the Grand Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen, has produced a likelihood of more than 95% that the parchment is older than 660 CE or AD. Other tests have yielded a 95% probability of the parchment of early manuscripts having been manufactured at some time between 649 and 675, or 606 and 652, or 568 and 645. In those last dates, 568 to 645, are for a fragment much celebrated, at least the dating was much celebrated, kept at Birmingham in the UK. He continues, although the radiocarbon dating of Quranic manuscript has produced occasional anomalies, you might want to speak about those because you mentioned them in the book, the increasing number of such tests would appear to confirm that a very considerable portion of Quranic text was around, albeit not with variants, by the 650s. Okay, that's a lot, and maybe I shouldn't have read so much, and I know there's a lot to say about it, but where would you begin in responding?
I would commend you for bringing this point right to the front. And indeed, there's a reason it's the third chapter in creating the Quran. The first two chapters deal with the literary evidence, which honestly, one of the arguments for the Quranic date around 650 is that supposedly the Islamic tradition is unanimous in ascribing this text to Uthman. Well, it's not. That's something that's falsifiable. And I've done that, particularly in the first chapter. And once I got that out of the way, it seemed, the really big elephant in the room has been the radiocarbon dating. And unfortunately, in the past decade or so, I think it's been used to shut down a lot of critical reflection on the Quran and its history, and without good reason. The first radiocarbon datings of the so-called Stanford folio, which I must emphasize was stolen and should not be published and should not be written about. It was illegally obtained from the collection in Yemen, and this is something we don't want to have anything to do with. But the results of that first came back right as Death of a Prophet came out, and I was like, well, interesting. Let me think, does that change a lot? No, it really didn't change much at Death of the Prophet. I can still, pretty much everything I said in there, I'd still stand by. But my initial response was to say, okay, science has spoken. And I think that's been the response a lot of other people had. And well, as a lot more data began to come out, more radiocarbon datings were published, I began talking more with people who knew some more about this, and and other people in medieval studies who are like, yeah, well, we like radiocarbon dating, but we don't tend to think it can date something so precisely as that. It's a great method, but it has its limits. And I became increasingly convinced that it was being misused. It was being evidence from scientific experiments, like any other evidence, has to be interpreted. And we could talk a lot about that and how the radiocarbon dating measurements have to be interpreted and what are the ins and outs of that. But they have to be interpreted, and the interpretation changes as our data set changes. And this is why I don't think we can commit too much to saying, aha, we got it, 650. What do we have? We have some old manuscripts. We have manuscripts that I'm pretty confident say, sure, this is from somewhere, maybe in the later 7th century, maybe the middle of the 7th century. Some of them from the early 8th century, it seems. This is the kind of thing we can say, this is a really old Quranic manuscript. Can we say it's 95% from 650? No, I really don't think that. But there are a lot of moving pieces going on here. I mean, first thing, you know this, you've written about this. The same object has been dated 4 different times with 4 different dates, right? Pretty much any time we've dated the same object twice, 4 times, we've come back with pretty different dates. This is a problem. As I explain in my book, right? One of the principles of the scientific method is an experiment is supposed to be repeatable, right? You do the same thing, you get the same result. You do the same thing, you get the same result. And we're not close to that at this moment, at least.
So you mean, Stephen, the folios from the Sena palimpsest, or the manuscripts found at the early Qur'an manuscripts found in Sena?
Yes and no. I mean, there's the famous Sena palimpsest, but there are other manuscripts from Sena that have been radiocarbon dating. I have in the book, I have all of the radiocarbon datings that have been published to my knowledge up until this point. But so, for instance, there's another set of folios from 2 different manuscripts in Sena, 3 from one manuscript, 2 from the other. All were radiocarbon dated. Each of those folios was dated in 2 different labs, one the Lyon lab, the other in the Zurich lab. And there are some different dates for these individual folios, within a single manuscript. And then there's the question of, how do you calibrate the date? And I have this in a nice chart in my book. I have a lot of charts of these dates for handy reference if you want to get a handle on a lot of these numbers flying around. And I'm not selling my book. It's free, by the way. It's open access, so go take a look. But there's a calibration curve that was published in 2013 that was used to determine a date for radiocarbon measurements. And now we had a new one that was just published, Intercal 20. It was published at the end of 2020. And so I've recalibrated all of the data. You can do this with, you get a little software program, you can recalibrate. Anyone can, and I have all of the raw data. I watched an earlier, one of your podcasts I watched recently was Sid Key's podcast, because I know he was talking about this. And he was saying that he couldn't talk about certain manuscripts because he didn't have the raw data. Well, I've got it. I don't know why he couldn't get it. It's in these online databases. You do need to know French to be able to navigate them, but it's all in there. And I've reproduced all of the data. The only thing we don't know about is there are these datings that Fred Donner has done that have also questioned the method that he hasn't published yet. And I've reported on them with his permission in there. But in any case, yeah, the numbers can be all over the place. I mean, what do you make of a manuscript that has one folio that dates sometime between 433 and 599 CE, and another one that dates 388 to 535 CE, but then that folio dates in a different lab to 590 to 650 CE. I mean, we're talking the same object, 2 different labs. We have dates centuries apart.
Well, but people, I think even, I think Saldeki maybe has written somewhere that there must have been in the Lyon lab and maybe the Zurich lab, there must have been contamination, and that explains it. And the testing that obtained the dates that are closer to the traditional date for Othman's codification, those are the ones that were more reliable.
That sounds protectionist, right? And it's special pleading. I mean, to my knowledge, no one has published any evidence suggesting that this was contaminated. And I think it's kind of, I don't know. I have more respect for French and Swiss scientists than that. I think they're competent. I don't see any reason to just categorically dismiss the results they get just because we like others better. I mean, I know I also saw in Sidki's talk, he used this, he says basically this is noise and we can filter it all out. Well, fine, show me. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to deploy a method and show how that's the case, and how we could all sit down with the same method and come to the same conclusion independently. I've not seen anything like that yet. And I would further add, I think all we're seeing is noise at this point, right?
The early dates are curious, and you're right. I have written about this question of the early dates. I mean, even Birmingham, which has a date range of 568 to 645, well, it's supposed to be an Uthmanic text type, but Uthman, I mean, that his work is at least traditionally dated, would have been around 650, not at the very end, but actually after the very end of that date range. So that does raise some questions. The early dates that have been given.
And if you look at that Birmingham Codex, it looks later. Right. And I would recommend to anyone who is interested in this question and interested in that manuscript, they should go read Alba Fideli's dissertation on this, which is also available free online. That's how I found it. And I think she makes a very compelling case why radiocarbon dating is important, but why it's not the only thing we should have in our toolkit.
That's an interesting point.
Right. And we can use it. Well, this is how almost any archaeologist would use it. Almost any medieval historian. It's not our only thing. We don't rely on it alone. It's one tool in our kit, and we have to consider along all of the other kinds of evidence that we have. But I'll go back to this example that was in Sitke's podcast. Just like when you take a thermometer and you put it in your mouth and you get 98, and you're like, well, that can't be right. And you put it back in, and then you get 98.6, 98.6, 98.6. Well, what I'm seeing in the data here is a 98, a 94, 101, a 97. I just don't see anything that is sort of a consistent pattern that we might say, well, that's just noise. To me, I just see things scattered all over the place. And you see folios in the same manuscript of widely divergent dates. And here I want to call out another problem that I call out in the book, and this is with the Corpus Quranicum project. They're dating the tubing in manuscript. So they took 3 radiocarbon measurements for 3 different folios. And what they did is they averaged them together. And then they took that one average measurement and calculated the date of the whole manuscript based on that. That's a problem, right? When you take the individual date of the latest folio and you take the radiocarbon dating for that and you're looking at something that's actually like sometime from the very end of the 8th century, so from the very end of the 7th century into the beginnings of the 8th century. So here's the thing. This leaves us with 2 important conclusions. One is that manuscript can't be any older, right, than this most recent part of it. It might have older parts, but it can't be, if we have a folio that's from 780, say, the manuscript can't be earlier than 780. And averaging to get a result you like that makes it earlier, that's really fudging the data, in my opinion. But the other thing that this manuscript shows us, if we take these folios individually and we assume that their different datings are correct, well, what we're looking at here in this manuscript is a single manuscript where folios of varying dates have been put together in one manuscript. Right? So we really can't know the age of a particular manuscript until we've dated every folio.
Every folio. Okay.
This is a huge problem. We're not nearly done with this yet.
Yeah, so interesting point that I would just encourage everyone to keep in mind about dating, which is as Professor Shoemaker is saying, a response to those who would say, well, carbon dating says this, is potentially, well, but carbon dating must be checked or controlled by paleography, that is the study of the script in particular, but also codicology. So other features of the parchment or the binding and those sorts of things. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, but I want to ask so I want to take this and try to put it into context of early Islamic history, which is usually what is done. Even certain studies that have been on carbon dating are pretty quick to then compare their results with the traditional narrative or with the traditional narratives of the codification of the Quran, which, as many of our viewers will know, the traditional report is that there was one, there's certain stories which involve Abu Bakr, the first caliph, reigns from 632 to 634, bringing together the Quran on writing, on suhuf, on individual sheets. But the principal work to bring the Quran together into one mushaf, one codex, is that of Uthman, the third caliph, who reigns from 644 to 656, at least according to traditional dates. Now, okay, so I want to assess this claim, the Uthmanic claim, and bring in some other evidence that you raised in the book, Creating the Quran, because, it there could be other arguments for Uthman. Now, you've already mentioned the beginning, the first two chapters, you deal with some of the traditional arguments that the Islamic sources attribute this to Uthman, therefore it is likely by Uthman. At least one argument that you address is the uniformity of the Quranic text, at least with the exception of the Sana palimpsest. The basic Quranic consonantal text is remarkably uniform across the manuscripts. So, I mean, doesn't that make it likely that there would be the project of one caliph who destroyed variant versions, just like we read about in the stories about Uthman?
Yes, I think that's true. But that caliph was not Uthman. The caliph was Abdul Malik.